What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the running back position for week 10 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday Night Football, we got the Falcons at the Panthers. Definitely an interesting matchup overall in terms of the game script for the last time that these two teams played each other. This should be a pretty good overall opportunity for the running backs involved, but at the same time, you guys know I hate these Thursday night matchups. And on top of that, we kind of have two backfields that are kind of forming overall committees. So let's start with the Falcons, right? I told you guys all last week there's a chance and an opportunity for multiple running backs to emerge and play well against an awful Chargers run defense in week 9, and I especially was a fan of Tyler Allgeier. He finished with 13.3 fantasy points, 99 rushing yards overall, and a reception for 24 receiving yards. Caleb Huntley, on the other hand, was the odd man out, which is 3.4 fantasy points after having 91 yards on the ground in week 8 against Carolina of all teams. CORDARRELLE Patterson shined in his return. Loved him as a flex option going into week 9. He had 18.3 fantasy points, 44 yards on the ground, 2 scores, and a reception for 9 receiving yards. So the way I'm looking at this is that this is still a committee, but Tyler Allgeier and CORDARRELLE Patterson are the primary beneficiaries of that committee. Patterson's going to see a lot of the red zone work, and Allgeier is going to see a lot of work leading up to the red zone. Like I said, this is a good matchup overall for both of these backs, so I do think we can consider flexing both Patterson and Allgeier. All right, moving on to the Panthers backfield. It's a little difficult to read at the moment. Foreman was on a really good pace in week 7 and 8, and then week 9 against the Cincinnati Bengals came absolutely back to earth with just 4.1 fantasy points. On top of that, we got CHUBB Hubbard more than likely making a return here in week 10. We know that he was very productive in week 7. On top of that, Raheem Blackshear got a little bit involved last week and scored a touchdown as well. And we still have Spencer Brown floating around, who's getting a couple touches here and there. So really, this is a difficult backfield to read, but it's a good game script, a good matchup on paper against the Falcons. I would stick with Foreman because overall, since CMC's departure from this team, he has been the most productive. But we definitely want to look at him with a capped ceiling after the performance last week, and with Blackshear getting a little bit involved, and with CHUBB Hubbard returning. So overall, it's not my favorite flex, but with the fact that Foreman had 31.8 points in week 8 against the Falcons, I think he's definitely worth consideration as we move into week 10. All right, moving on to Sunday's slate, we've got the Seahawks at the Buccaneers. Told you guys all week long, really over the last 2 weeks, just begged you guys, no matter who you have on your team, you need to be keeping Kenneth Walker in your starting lineup. Some of you guys got a little bit afraid after the performance in week 8 against the Giants, where he finished with just 12.2 fantasy points, but both Steven and I kept encouraging guys, like on a weekly basis, the ceiling that Walker brings is far too high to sit him. Finished with 27.9 fantasy points in week 9. His second best performance of the season, 109 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, and 20 receiving yards overall. Regardless of matchup, Kenneth Walker is a must start on a week-to-week basis. All right, moving on to the Buccaneers backfield. Leonard Fournette finished with 11 fantasy points in week 9 against a stout Rams run defense. He had 19 yards on the ground and 41 receiving yards, so a decent day overall, but on a consistent basis, it just feels like he's being capped in terms of the way this offense is playing. And we continue to see a little bit of Rachaad White on a week-in, week-out basis. Rachaad White had a season high of 8 touches on the ground and a season high of 11 total touches in week 9. So he's still a factor, but at the end of the day, this Seattle Seahawks team has been very bad against opposing running backs. The defense as a whole has played well, but this is one of their weaknesses. So I do think, although Fournette hasn't been entirely promising, he's still your RB9 on the season. This is a good enough matchup that Fournette should still be a flex option as we approach the week. I moved on to the Lions at Bears. I like this game script overall for the week. We know that the Bears are really emerging as a powerhouse offense in the NFL, and the Lions continue to play bad defense, so we should see some pretty good opportunities overall for both backfields, but the issue is you really got two true committees going into this game. So that means we are flexing the Lions running backs and we are flexing the Bears running backs. We can't lock them in as RB1s or RB2s unless we're absolutely desperate. So DeAndre Swift in week 9, 8 fantasy points overall, and Jamal Williams 10 fantasy points overall. Not a great outing for the Lions running backs, but really the game script was just kind of difficult to read throughout the entire game. Jamal Williams had 81 yards on the ground. DeAndre Swift had just 10 yards on the ground, but he had 3 receptions for 40 receiving yards, no touchdowns by either running back. Once again, it's a good game script here, pretty good matchup overall. The Bears allowed a lot of points to the Miami Dolphins last week. I think this is a good opportunity for both backs, but you know, on a week in, week out basis, Swift and Williams just cap each other's upside, and it's a little difficult to read, but I do think that they're both worth a flex. Khalil Herbert, I had a lot of faith in week 9. He finished with 2.3 fantasy points, 23 yards on the ground, and Montgomery on the other hand had 36 yards on the ground and 1 reception, 5.4 fantasy points. I mean, obviously it was Justin Fields who stole the day on the ground with 178 rushing yards. Listen, this is a really good matchup for the Bears running back. So even with the poor performance in week 9, keep in mind that game script, you know, the Bears had to throw the football a lot, even though Fields ended up running the football a lot. It's not like those were designed run plays all the way through the game. So this should be a better game script for the Bears running backs, and it's too good of a matchup to ignore. So they are definitely worth a flex as we approach week 10. I moved on to the Browns at the Dolphins. We just talked about the Dolphins really creating competitive game scripts from a fantasy perspective. And on top of that, Nick Chubb is a start on a week in, week out basis. He's your RB5 in full PPR at the moment, RB2 in standard scoring formats, and he was on bye week last week. With all of that being said, he only has one performance this year with less than 15 fantasy points. He is a start. I don't care who he is playing. We're starting Nick Chubb. Moving right along, I do think that we can consider Kareem Hunt in the flex because, once again, this Miami Dolphins team, as good as they are allowing for really good game scripts and competitive offensive game scripts. So don't love Hunt, but he's always worth a flex. He finished with 11.2 fantasy points in week 8. I could see a similar ceiling moving into the week against the Dolphins. Looking at the Dolphins running backs, we've got a true committee emerging between Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. So Mostert had 8.6 fantasy points in week 9, really saved his day with a touchdown. Outside of that, just 26 yards on the ground. Jeff Wilson, on the other hand, had the better fantasy day with 16.2 fantasy points, 51 yards on the ground, 3 receptions for 21 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. So there's definitely value to both of these running backs. We've seen the value earlier in the season with Mostert, and he still scored a touchdown against Chicago, so he's still getting the opportunity. He's still in 9 touches, right? Wilson only had 9 touches on the ground as well, so it's even there. Wilson just got more work in the receiving game, obviously. So once again, the Dolphins should allow a good competitive game script. I think Wilson and Mostert are worth a flex, but we're going to need a larger sample size before we can really identify who's going to be the lead back for the Miami Dolphins. So at the moment, we're going to flex them as we approach week 10. All right, Broncos at Titans. This is a relatively tough matchup both ways. Both of these defenses have played pretty well against the run all season long. So Latavius Murray in week 8 had 12.9 fantasy points. Melvin Gordon had 14.2 fantasy points in week 8. So there's definitely value to both of these running backs. This is as much of a committee as we have in the entire league, but it's a tough matchup against the Titans. Just look at what they did against the Kansas City Chiefs last week. They essentially allowed like under 20 rushing yards. So don't get me wrong, I do think that the Broncos are better suited for a good run game, but I just don't love them going into the week. So I've got Gordon and Latavius Murray as sits, unless you're just absolutely desperate, and even then you're flipping a coin and hoping that one of them falls into the end zone. On the other hand, Derrick Henry is your RB3 in PPR, your RB1 in standard scoring formats. He had 23.5 fantasy points in week 9, 115 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Listen, guys, the Titans don't have receivers. They hardly have a quarterback. I mean, for crying out loud, in the last 2 weeks, Malik Willis has 11 passing completions. I mean, it's obvious what the Titans are going to do. The Houston Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs in the last 2 weeks have not been able to stop it. There's a chance that Ryan Tannehill returns in week 10. Be interesting to see how the Broncos fare against Derrick Henry, but I'm going to bet on Derrick Henry as we move into week 10, and regardless, you're starting Henry on a weekly basis. All right, Vikings at Bills. It's a tough matchup overall for Dalvin Cook as we approach the week. We know that the Bills have played very well against the running back position. They didn't look as good against the run. Michael Carter had a pretty good week in week 9, but overall in the season, they played well, right? Dalvin Cook had 13.6 fantasy points in week 9, 47 yards on the ground, 2 receptions for 9 receiving yards, and a really nice receiving touchdown. Nice little one-hander. But at the end of the day, we're starting Dalvin Cook. He's a top 12 fantasy back. More than likely, where you drafted him, you're going to need to start him, so he remains in our starting lineups. On the other hand, I'm sitting the Bills running backs. Just too much inconsistency, not good enough ceilings for this group. I really warned you guys, if you picked up Nyheim Hines, please don't start him in week 9. It's just too soon. Don't get me wrong, he can carve out a nice role within that offense, but Singletary in the last 2 weeks has had 9.3 or less fantasy points. Unless one of the Bills running backs stumbles into the end zone, they essentially have 0 fantasy value. And the Vikings, although they were playing very poorly against the run towards the beginning of the season, they have really improved overall in terms of their run defense, so it's not actually a great matchup also. So I would sit the Bills running backs, and we'll give Dalvin Cook a start as we approach week 10. All right, Texans at Giants, a little bit of a tough matchup for Dameon Pierce, but it does not matter. He is a start on a week in, week out basis. Had 139 yards on the ground against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 9, so I say he gets it done. Again, he's a safe lock for double-digit fantasy points. He's had double-digit fantasy points every week since week 3 with a ceiling of 25.9 fantasy points. Don't really care who he's playing at this point. If he can have over 130 rushing yards against the Eagles, I feel safe with him on a weekly basis. Another running back I feel safe with on a weekly basis is going to be SAQUON Barkley, undoubtedly coming in as your RB6 and full PPR at the moment. He has had double-digit fantasy points in every game this year, and the Houston Texans are the worst team in the NFL against opposing running backs from a fantasy perspective. He is a must start. He's going to have a massive week in week 10. All right, next up on the list, we've got the Jaguars at the Chiefs. Travis Etienne is a top 12 fantasy football running back. Ever since the departure of James Robinson, he has really stepped up as the lead back for the Jaguars. He's had at least 12 fantasy points in his last 5 weeks. He's had at least 25 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks, and the Chiefs have not played well against opposing running backs on the season. Derrick Henry just absolutely tore them up on Sunday Night Football. ETN is a lock. He is a must start moving in to the week. On the other hand, we've got a committee over there in Kansas City. It's a pretty decent matchup against the Jaguars. Not the best, not the worst, but I really don't want to start any of these running backs. Isaiah Pacquiao did absolutely nothing in week 9, 1.9 fantasy points against the Titans in his first start, quote-unquote start for the Kansas City Chiefs in week 7 against the Niners. He had just 4.3 fantasy points. I mean, don't get me wrong, the San Francisco 49ers and the Tennessee Titans have played very well against opposing running backs, so we should maybe give him a break here if you're desperate, but I just don't love him moving into the week. Clyde Edwards-Helaire has essentially done nothing in the last 2 weeks. In week 7, he salvaged his fantasy stat line with a touchdown, but he had just 32 yards on the ground, and then in week 9, he had just 5 yards on the ground. Jerick McKinnon had a decent week in week 9 against the Titans, but that was all through the receiving game. 6 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and that was 100% due to the game script. So I just don't love the Chiefs running backs. For me, they are sits as we approach week 10. All right, next up, you got the Saints at the Steelers. You're starting Alvin Kamara on a week in, week out basis. At the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, but I really don't care what the outcome is. The ceiling is far too high for Alvin Kamara since week 5. Outside of week 9, like I said, hasn't been played yet. He's had at least 17.5 fantasy points. Don't care who he's playing. As long as he's not suspended, he is in our starting lineup on a weekly basis. On the other hand, Najee Harris is still a flex opportunity in my eyes. Is the ceiling good? No, it's not. It's not good. But is the floor pretty safe? It is. I mean, in the last 3 performances he's had at least 11 fantasy points. He was on bye week in week 9. Not the greatest matchup against the Saints, not the worst. So I do think that Najee Harris can be a flex option as we approach week 10. Moving on to the Colts at Raiders. At the moment, I've got Deon Jackson as a flex, believe it or not. But at the moment, we also don't know if Jonathan Taylor is going to be good to go in week 10. I really think you can consider flexing JT or Deon Jackson going into this matchup, especially a healthy Jonathan Taylor. It's a good matchup against a struggling Raiders defense. And listen, it might surprise you that I'm considering Deon Jackson, but I warned you guys all week, like, yeah, Jackson is worth the pickup, but there was two aspects going into week 9. The first aspect was Sam Ehlinger's a quarterback and not Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan dumped it off to Jackson a ton, especially in week 6. I mean, Jackson had 10 targets and 10 receptions in week 6. And week 5, he had 4 targets, 4 receptions. He still had 3 targets and 2 receptions in week 9, but I also warned you guys, the second aspect is throughout the season, the New England Patriots going into week 9 were the second best team against opposing running backs. So a little bit leery. He finished with just 5.6 fantasy points. A really disappointing week for those of you who needed him with so many teams on bye week. But like I said, the Raiders are a completely different team. It's a new week. I think he's worth a flex if JT is out. If JT is not out, then JT is absolutely worth a flex. But I get it, guys. This Colts running back room has been extremely disappointing throughout the entirety of the season, except for like week 1 when Jonathan Taylor did good things. Outside of that, let's move on to the Raiders backfield. Josh Jacobs has also been relatively disappointing, but at the end of the day, I mean, he was just playing at an extremely high level. He had 30 or more fantasy points for 3 weeks straight, came back to earth in week 8 against the Saints in a game where the Raiders got completely blown out. He finished with just 7.4 fantasy points in week 9. Still got you double digits in full PPR, 11.7 fantasy points, 67 yards on the ground, and 20 receiving yards. I like this matchup against the Colts. They've been better against the receiver position than the running back position. Their run defense has actually been struggling. So Jacob still comes in as a top 7 fantasy running back. I think he's someone that we have to start on a weekly basis as we approach week 10. All right, Cardinals at Rams. I would sit the Cardinals running backs. Don't get me wrong, James Conner had a good performance in week 9, but that was against the Seattle Seahawks run defense and not the Rams run defense. There are two things the Rams have been really good at all year: throwing to Cooper Kupp and playing against the run. So I don't hate Conner if you're desperate enough, if you're dealing with injuries, dealing with bye weeks, but overall, I would sit the Cardinals running backs. Benjamin had a really disappointing week in week 9. I don't even know if we can consider him moving forward. I mean, the advantage to James Conner is that Kyler Murray was really targeting him in desperate situations. 5 targets, 5 receptions. That's a big reason of why he finished with double digits in full PPR scoring formats. Like I said, Conner is okay in a desperate situation, especially because he'll be in on those passing formations. But overall, I just don't love this backfield moving into the week. On top of that, I don't love the Rams backfield because, oh my gosh, they are all over the place at the moment. In week 9 against Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Henderson had 12 touches for 56 rushing yards, finished with 5.6 fantasy points. Ronnie Rivers had 8 touches, 21 rushing yards, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 15 receiving yards, 7.6 fantasy points. And Malcolm Brown added 2 touches and 1 reception. I just don't like this backfield from a fantasy perspective, and it's not worth like taking a guess on who's going to score a touchdown. Let's just stay away from the Rams backfield as we approach week 10. Our Cowboys at Packers. I say we start Tony Pollard. Just start him, okay? I mean, for weeks here, guys, I've been saying flex the Cowboys running backs because they cap each other's ceilings. At the moment, we don't know if Zeke's going to play in week 10 or not. If he's healthy, I say we flex him. But let's give Tony Pollard a freaking start for once after having 33.7 points in week 8 as a lead back for the Cowboys. I would be highly surprised if he doesn't get a couple added touches, even if Zeke is healthy, as we approach the week. So both are solid flex options, but I'll give the nod to Pollard at the moment. Don't get me wrong, I'm not out on Zeke at all, but I think that Pollard's starting to eat some of that momentum. All right, moving on to the Packers running backs. The time that I'm recording this, don't have an exact update on Aaron Jones. If he plays, yes, we can start Aaron Jones, even in a tough matchup against the Cowboys defense. But if he does not play, then I'm probably sitting the Packers running backs, right? We got A.J. Dillon, who got 11 touches in week 9, 34 rushing yards, 2 receptions, 10 receiving yards. And we got Kylon Hill, who just had 1 carry with Aaron Jones out in week 9. So if Jones plays, I mean, the upside's too high. But at the moment, reports are indicating that he should be able to play. But I'm not going to go off a quote-unquote should be able to play as we're making these early week decisions. So definitely keep an eye on Aaron Jones. But at the moment, the Packers running backs are a sit as we move in to week 10. All right, Chargers at Niners. Man, oh man, Austin Eckler is a bad man. I mean, really, should have had 3 touchdowns in this game against the Atlanta Falcons in week 9, but came up with 24.1 fantasy points, 47 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 7 receptions on 9 targets, 24 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. He's your RB1 in full PPR at the moment. He is a start even against a very stout San Francisco 49ers run defense. They are the best in the league against opposing running backs. You still have to start Austin Ekeler. He will be in enough passing formations with how many receivers are still out for the Chargers. I mean, I really don't care who Ekeler is going up against. He has to be a start on a week in, week out. Ace says Christian McCaffrey moved back a couple spots. He was your RB1. Him and Ekeler are going to be battling, but also CMC was on bye week in week 9, so he moves back to your RB4. He's got a gorgeous matchup. I mean, this Chargers run defense has been trash all season long. CMC is really coming into his own with the Niners. He's been fantastic all season long, but 40.2 points in week 8 was just crazy. It feels like a century ago, but we cannot forget about how dominant he was in week 8, and the fact that he gets the Chargers run defense in week 10 is almost unfair. This is going to be a battle for the #1 overall running back in fantasy football. Potentially, we're starting Ekeler and we're starting CMC as we approach week 10. All right, Monday Night Football, we got the Commanders at the Eagles. I'm sitting Antonio Gibson. I'm sitting Brian Robinson. I was pretty confident in Antonio Gibson having a good week in week 9 and being a good flex play after performing well in week 7 and 8, but he finished with just 6.7 fantasy points, 36 yards on the ground, 11 receiving yards. A very disappointing week. And Brian Robinson, on the other hand, has really come down in fantasy value. After having just 2 points in week 8, he finished with 5.8 points in week 9, 44 yards on the ground, and -6 receiving yards. So this backfield is definitely a committee. They're hard to read. We know that Dameon Pierce had success on a short week at home against the Eagles, but I don't necessarily think that's going to happen here in week 10 for the Commanders running backs. This game is in Philadelphia. It's a long rested week for the Eagles. They're going to come out firing. Man, this Eagles unit is not one to underestimate. I'm sitting Gibson and Brian Robinson as we move into the week. On the other hand, we got Miles Sanders coming in as your RB15 in full PPR. He is playing some great football. He only has 2 games this year where he's finished with less than 11 fantasy points with a ceiling of 29.6 fantasy points. He's had at least 13 or more fantasy points in his last 3 performances. I don't really care who he's playing. He's as solid as an RB2 or a flex option as you're going to get at the position. This should be a good game script for Miles Sanders, where I feel like the Eagles will be closing out this game at the end of the 3rd quarter. Not completely underestimating the Commanders, but I could see a lot of touches to try and eat some clock at the end of this game for Miles Sanders. And keep in mind, I still think Kenneth Gainwell is worth a flex option. He had 12.8 fantasy points in week 9, but at any point, you know, Boston Scott could get a couple touches. But if you're desperate enough and you want to flex Gainwell, I'm not completely against it. But overall, Miles Sanders a start for me as we approach week 10. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And of course, let me know who are your starting running backs as we approach week 10 of the season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.